Hi, everybody. This is Deirdre von Krauskopf and Sean Wyman of Going Beyond the Call. We were both very honored to be asked to participate in the domestic violence rally today, run by Cynthia Hale, and she and a whole bunch of really amazing panelists really educated us in many ways. We had a lot that we wanted to say on the subject. Certainly, we both have backgrounds and experiences that bring this near and dear to our hearts. And we felt that maybe we could add a little bit of value to our listeners, to the people that were part of that rally group, and just generally in the future on this topic. So we're going to share a little bit about ourselves. We're going to share a little bit about some key topic issues that we feel would be prevalent to those listening. And I'm going to start with Sean. Sean's going to share a little bit about himself, and then that'll be back to me.
So hey everybody, this is the first Going Beyond the Call segment. We're gonna do many more of these, and Dee and I have been trying to figure out like how we could start putting some stuff together and just start putting some of these trainings out there, because we've been asked, hey, when are you gonna start putting some stuff out there on social media and kind of get yourselves out there. So this is our first official dynamic duo, if you will. So very excited to connect with you guys. For those of you that are watching for the first time, thank you. For those of you that know me and you're watching, thank you. Greatly appreciate it. Dee and I both are honored to have the opportunity to talk to you guys a little bit. But because I know there's going to be some people that watch that this might be the first time, my name is Sean Wyman. I am a 20-year law enforcement professional. I have over 18 years in high liability training between defensive tactics and firearms, and really just have a passion for teaching and training. And what I'm really excited about today is to be able to unfold this topic a little bit and talk about how domestic violence really impacts us in the first responder industry, as well as through the military. I faced a lot of challenges growing up, and one of those was witnessing domestic violence, watching my stepfather beat my mom. And I'm going to share a little bit of insight later on that. But as that evolved, I went into the military, and as a supervisor in the military, I started to witness my soldiers getting involved in domestic violence, and even my soldiers being abused, by their spouses. And again, what you don't know, you just don't know. So we didn't have the right resources back then. But I'll reflect back on some of that as well. And then now in law enforcement, over 20 years, a lot of that being on the road and just interacting and dealing with abuse and domestic violence on a regular basis. So, Dee, really excited to share some insight and be a part of this.
Yeah, absolutely. And although I haven't published my book Unquiet Warrior, it does go into Sean and I. One of the reasons we connected so well was we both had uh, fairly traumatic childhoods, and that was extreme abuse in my case, a lot of mental abuse, which isn't something that is talked about quite as much. The psychological aspect of cruelty, manipulation and fear tactics. So I think some of those things need to be addressed, and we want to touch on those today. And growing up in an environment where with a bipolar father who had very violent tendencies, you could go from everything's good to everything's very bad very quickly. And you learn as a child to become incredibly hyper alert and aware of your surroundings, the body language, all those little indicators that say things are going to go south real fast. And as much as I would never wish that on any other person, it really began my career in really understanding and becoming an expert in human behavior. And that has followed me with every different job I've held, and really helped enhance what I could do to help people, kind of accumulating to what we're doing now when we're working in trauma informed care. So they are important topics to share and talk about. And when we're dealing with military and police, as a 26-year spouse of a law enforcement officer, I had some experience as both a military and police trauma support person. So I got to hear it kind of from the spouse's perspective in both those arenas, listening to people who were afraid to step forward, fear that they weren't going to be believed, fear that they had no recourse because they were very loyal and protective of their abuser, because that abuser had suffered huge trauma as well. And so there's a lot of things that are very special to this particular community of military and paramilitary organizations that we're going to touch on today. And we'll get into that a little bit more as we move forward. So Sean, tell me about You have spent, we've shared so many stories about, as a law enforcement officer, how it just wrenches your gut when you walk into a domestic abuse, situation. So tell us a little bit about, from a law enforcement, how do you perceive people? How do you work from an empathetic perspective as well as a law enforcement officer perspective in that arena?
Well, I'll be honest with you. When I first got started in law enforcement, that wasn't an easy thing to do, especially with, not forgiving my stepfather for all the abuse that I took personally and all the abuse that I watched him do to my mom. So when I got started in this profession, I was very one-sided. And in law enforcement, you can't do that. In law enforcement, you always have to stay neutral because that's what it's about, right? It's about being fair and balanced. It's about getting both sides of the story. And I always joke about this when I interact with people. I go, look, you're going to have your story, they're going to have their story, and in the middle is going to be the truth somewhere. And but you need to have both pieces. You can't just have one. But when I got started, it was really easy for me to get sucked in to wanting to immediately fall into supporting the victim and not really giving the perpetrator or the suspect the opportunity to put their side out there. And it wasn't until years later when even after we met and I started going into the communication training and learning all about human behavior and gaining experience through learning from you. And of course, huge shout out to James McNeil. We'll plug him right now because he was a big part of that.
Absolutely.
But it wasn't until I started really learning about human behavior and trauma informed care and really identifying how to connect those dots,
Yeah.
and then recognizing that my own trauma was affecting me, my own abuse was affecting me, my own experiences as a child and witnessing the things that my mom went through, those affected me and those triggered me. And a lot of times when I got triggered, I would say and do things that would trigger either the abuser or the victim in an inappropriate way. And it wasn't intentional. It was really just because I didn't know any better, because, it was really unconsciously incompetent to the fact that I could be triggered and that, the things that I said could trigger them. So, I think that's something that we really want to emphasize is that there needs to be more training on the front end when it comes to dealing with the social emotional aspects when we deal with something like domestic violence, so we don't fall into the trap of weighing ourselves to one side or the other and doing the best we can to stay rational and neutral in these situations, even when it's blatantly obvious. Because again, as you evolve and you start to recognize that what the effects that trauma have on people, you begin to realize it's not necessarily about what's wrong with them. It's really easy to point the finger and go, what's wrong with you? Why do you keep hitting your wife? Or what's wrong with you? Why do you keep hitting your spouse or significant other?
Yeah.
And not reflecting back on what actually happened to them, not talking about the generational trauma, not talking about the things that actually lead to healing and recovery, and so that they can actually stop beating their wife, maybe, or stop abusing their children, or whatever the case may be, by going back and kind of helping them to reflect upon what happened to them that actually led to where they're in this abusive moment. Whether they're either, and it goes for victims too, because a lot of victims, they have the generational trauma as well, and they see a spouse or significant other that goes through the abuse, and so they naturally are attracted to an abuser. And then of course that abuser kind of grooms them and puts them into the same circumstances as what they saw from their past, and it's just a really vicious cycle, isn't it, Dee?
It absolutely is. Like, think domestic abuse, child abuse, it's all predicated on fear, right? And a really good manipulator is usually trained, like the bully in high school tends to be the person who's a victim at home, right? So we know these cycles of abuse are there. We know generational trauma is there. Well, I saw my mom getting beaten up all the time or manipulated this way, so that's kind of, I guess that's the way it is. And we don't necessarily recognize that something might not be very healthy for us. There's the rescuer. If we deal with Stephen Cartman's drama triangle, we tend to, with different types of people, be the victim, the rescuer, or the persecutor. And we can play all those roles in even one argument. And that can incent different escalating aspects of aggravation and assault. We understand the fight, flight, freeze, most of us, but we think about it in terms of, running away or fist fighting or, I'm going to freeze like an animal before I get eaten. But there are layers to that we don't understand, or we don't necessarily, as law enforcement officers, as MPs, as family and support workers for somebody that we know that has been abused, is to know that a fight response can also be aggressiveness. So if you're getting into an argument with your spouse and you start throwing objects around or punching the wall or doing something else that's incredibly aggressive, that's triggering the other person and you start a cycle. We don't understand that it isn't always physical violence. A lot of the times it's the screaming, the shouting, that escalating verbal violence that is a fight response. We don't understand when it comes to flight, running away isn't always physically leaving. It could be obsessive compulsive behaviors or self-harming, where you're just basically trying to get away from that internalized fear by distracting or doing other things that kind of take you away from it. So a flight response isn't necessarily leaving the situation. And the freeze response, we talk about freezing, people just think people are frozen up, and that's very true. And this becomes a huge problem with investigative services, whether that's the like legal system, the attorneys, whether that's the police officers, whether that's the medical staff or the trauma staff, first responders, EMTs. They tend to ask a lot of questions that can be victim blaming because they don't understand the trauma that goes with it. And that can clam somebody up or shut them up. They don't understand why they didn't fight or scream or shout or run away. They don't know what happened inside them. And so some of the questioning investigative techniques can really harm someone, because freezing could be, it's numbing, it's disassociation, it's kind of closing in on yourself. I know I'm about to get really, really hurt. I know I don't have any ability to do anything about it. And you can have either tonic immobility, meaning you can't shout, you can't scream, you can't call out, and that immobility is not well known. Or you can have collapsed immobility, that feeling, I'm so overpowered, I'm frozen, I just lie there. And so if you have an investigator now questioning you, why didn't you fight back? Why didn't you scream or shout for help? Why didn't you say something? Well, there's
Yeah.
reasons for that, and we don't understand that brain science well. And then the fawning, we don't get at all. Peter Walker brought this out in Complex PTSD from Surviving to Thriving. He termed it as the basically appeasing the abuser. If I make you as happy as I can be, and this is huge in the sex slave, trades and stuff like that. If I'm going to try to make you happy, I'm going to try to be so codependent that I deny all my self rights, and I'm just here to please. And it's like an overwhelming people pleasing response, the fawn response, and that's huge and common in a lot of abuse situations. Because if I can make you, the abuser, happy, maybe I'm not going to be as hurt, right? And we don't necessarily see beyond that. So all of these things are things that really impact military and paramilitary organizations because they're so closed. They're very closed environments. And even internally, even if we know there is somebody abusing in the military, like whether it's a peer or, like as you said, a subordinate, or in the policing environment, nobody wants that out there in the public. It's a very closed, let's keep it to ourselves, very high stigma, environment. And so by the investigators not knowing how to ask the questions, sometimes that reality doesn't get to see the light of day, and that fear is, even worse, because they feel that I can't tell anybody if my military spouse is abusing me, or my law enforcement, fire, EMT spouse is abusing me, or corrections, which has, a lot of domestic, violence in it. Those are all fields, because of the high stress and incredible trauma that comes with those particular jobs, that that violent output is higher and more common.
I think that's a good place for me to share a story. When I was in the military, I remember I was a sergeant at the time, and I had a squad under me, and one of my soldiers was married to a woman who was from Puerto Rico, and she was very small, but very, very strict and very mean. That's the best way I can put it, right? She was just really mean. And one night I got a phone call at like 3 o'clock in the morning. It was my soldier calling me saying, I need you to come over here. I just got beat with a frying pan. And I was like, what? And I got there, and sure enough, man, he had, cheated on her. And she found out, and she waited till he went to sleep, and she got one of those cast iron skillets and tried to bust his head in. And I mean, it was bad. And the sad part was we didn't, because we weren't trained for it, we didn't see it as domestic violence. We saw it as, I need to protect my soldier because this is the guy that's going to combat with me. This is the guy I got to have ready. And my goal was just get him out of there, right? But we never went back and focused on the problem, which was the interaction between them. All I kept telling him was, she's crazy, man. You need to get a divorce, right? Because that's all we knew at that point, right? Was, what are you doing, man? Why would you let somebody do that to you?
Yeah.
And that was just the way it was, though. Was she was very mean. That was the way she was brought up. And she didn't play around when it came to that kind of thing. So I as I look back at that, I go, okay, man, it would have been really nice to have a better understanding of what I was actually witnessing, so I could have actually identified that, hey, you know what, they need marriage counseling. Hey, you know what, they may need to talk to somebody from a spiritual aspect if they're spiritual, or they need to, maybe get them in front of some kind of counsel or somebody, some resources, right? And we really didn't have any resources. And you're absolutely right. We're very, very protective of our soldiers and very protective of their situations, and will do things even when they're in the wrong sometimes to protect them because we think we're doing what's right.
Right, you are, Sean. And I think that, to take it even further, like, not, beyond a peer perspective, as a spouse, there's that same protectiveness that is very prevalent, especially amongst paramilitary and military organizations. When we see someone we love go out and deal with unimaginable things on a day-to-day basis or deployment basis, and they come back and their behavior is affected by that, there is a strong need to want to protect them, or to at least be aware that, gosh, they've gone through something really traumatic and we have to support them in some way, shape, or form, even though in some situations, whatever those acting outs or behaviors will be could cause harm to ourselves or to our family. And that's really strongly ingrained and not necessarily understood quite as well as it could. And then you have the organizational structures. Often you'll have trauma support teams, which I'm familiar with, or you'll have psychologists or people recommended, but they're tied to the organization. So there's a lack of trust that if someone goes in and shares, maybe some of the more negative experiences that are happening, behind closed doors, then the person that you care about or you're trying to help is going to be benched, or they won't be able to be deployed, or they'll lose the career or position that they love. And so again, that protectiveness comes in. That whole rescuer aspect is, I want to try to help them. I'm going to help them change, or I'm going to be there, support them, because I'm in it for the good, bad, and ugly. So I have to do these things. And so you'll have a lot of spouses in these organizations that I've heard from that say, yeah, I really wanted to say what I needed to say so that I could get him or her the help that they needed, but I was too afraid that if I did that, that I would actually cause more damage to my relationship. So I just stayed mute. And then you start to build that whole codependency issue that is, prevalent and problematic. And in my own experiences, I had a spouse that, had tons of trauma throughout his career, yet he had one big incident that caused, huge behavior changes, PTSD, big time behavior changes. And as I watched those behavior changes, having, a background in human behavior, having a background, where I studied psychology and kind of got rid of all of my, what I thought anyway, got rid of all of my, childhood demons, I kind of understood what was going through, and I was incredibly protective of, what he was going through. But at the same time, I did not recognize how much some of those behavior changes were actually causing me to have behavior changes. So my triggers, those childhood triggers that I thought were long vaulted and, so far behind me and not an issue anymore in my life because everything was so good for so long, things started bubbling up and coming out until I understood emotional intelligence, until I understood, ego states and, all of the psychology behind trauma. Until I got that education and understanding, it was easy to blame. It was easy to say it was somebody else's fault. And yet, when you get this understanding, you realize how much you have to do with some of the escalated situations that you might have been in, and how much you had to do with not managing, the trauma that became, part of the family unit. And that's where we want to do that preemptive striking, that preemptive education, that pre-escalation training. We want to make sure that we get in there before that stuff happens. And that's really the whole goal of going beyond the call. It's, we can do mitigation, prevention, and tactics to help you after the fact. But gosh, wouldn't it be awesome if we could get in before the fact and make it part of basic and beginning training, and education for all sides, so that we don't have to go there. Or when we do have to face it, we know what we're actually dealing with. And both parties, or all parties in a family situation, are much more aware and ready for how to manage trauma and how it hits home.
So let me throw a question back at you, Dee, because I love this back and forth.
Yeah.
So many people focus on the physical abuse, but isn't the mental and the psychological abuse just as damaging, if not more?
Well, damaging is it's a point of reference, right? It depends on who the victim is and how they perceive what's happening to them, because everything's 100% to you, the person on the receiving end. In my case, as a child, like my father, if he triggered, he would be all fists, ask questions later. But like literally, this sounds really horrible, but I could, stick my finger in my nose and make myself bleed. As soon as he saw blood, he'd stop. He had enough control. He had that background.
And real quick, let me jump in because some people in our audience, they might not know what that word trigger means, right? Can you
Okay, yeah.
explain that a little bit more?
Yeah, absolutely. So triggering, think of something that happened to you as a child, a young person, or else, that was traumatic, or frightening, or just really made a mental imprint on you. From that point forward, there could be things. It could be something you visualize, something you feel. It could be a smell, a taste, any of your senses that might recollect, hey, this was a really impactful moment, and now something else is happening, and I'm going to have that emotional recall, in the current event. So think of it, if you saw your mom, getting beaten, like you talked about, your mom gets beaten. Every time you go to a call now where you see a woman getting beaten, and even more so if it was a woman that maybe looked like your mom getting beaten, you're going to have that emotional response you had back when that initial trauma damage happened. It's going to pop up, and it's not going to pop up as a memory, oh, I remember this thing. It's going to pop up as an emotional response. So that's what it means by triggering. There is, call it baggage, call it, trauma that you had from some point in your life. Those things left an emotional responsiveness trigger, and our personalities will carry that through, especially if it happened more than once, or if it was a really large or impactful trauma. That imprint will pop out at different times and how you react. And that's why sometimes you'll see, you'll have the same argument with the same people all the time at family events, or you'll see something and you get immediately irritated, but you may not necessarily understand why you're getting irritated, or why that particular behavior or tonality or body language bugs you, but it does. So that's a trigger. And when we understand what triggers are, not only can we learn to manage and get rid of them, because they may not serve us anymore, and that's the really important part of our training. It's about that strategic communications within your own self as well as with others. It's like, if I understand what my hot button is, if I understand what gets me going, then I now have the power and control to be able to change that response. Because if it's not working for me anymore, then why do I keep carrying it forward? But if we don't understand what it is, or where it's coming from, or why it's happening, well, who's going to fix something when they don't understand what the problem is? And that's what a triggering is. Thanks for asking that question, Sean. And
Yeah.
coming back to the psychological of that, one of the things is I got abused more by my stepmother than my father. So I know it isn't always the men that are the abusers. And she was
Yeah.
incredibly cruel about it. She would drag me around the house by my hair until clumps came out. She would hit me with frying pans. She stabbed me with paring knives. She'd slam, books on top of my head if, I hummed while I was studying. Like, she did really cruel things. And so there was that psychological aspect to it. Now, her first husband, and her had adopted a physically challenged son, and he was in a wheelchair, and he was quite, severely handicapped. Trying to find the right politically correct word these days, because it changes every couple of years. And for him, what they told me is, if you ever report us to the police, They're going to come, they're going to take you away, and you're going to go into foster care, and they're going to rape you and beat you even worse than we do. But
Wow.
Kevin's going to go into an institution, and they're going to rape and abuse him, and it's going to be all your fault.
Wow.
That kind of level of psychological abuse, like, I was terrified of the place. I was
I
terrified of
bet.
ever reporting anything because I love my little brother. I wanted to protect him. You know, my brother protected me. He'd jump in the way of my father's violent and Phoebe's violent outrages all the time until she almost drowned him in the kitchen sink and killed him. And he ran away at 14. And then I was the one left being the protector.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of times we're in these scenarios and people don't understand, why do you stay? You know, my brother ran away at 14. I ran away at 14. We both escaped, but a lot of people can't. You know, they have, distorted thinking of their self-worth. They may have, that rescuer. Oh, if I could just do this, I can change him or her. You know,
That
if I,
was that was my mom, D. That was
yeah,
my mom. My
you know,
mom for
that
30 years, my mom was like, I love him. He can change. I see the good in him. It was like a Star Wars movie, right? I see the good in him, even though he stays evil. And, it was one of those things where it was like, come on, you can't see this, right? And you're like banging your head because you're so frustrated because you just want to see, them get out of that situation and stop having to go through that. And I see now, the toll that is taken on my mom for all the abuse that she took for all of those years. And I would love to say to anybody that's watching this that may be in a domestic violence situation, please, please, please reassess your situation and really define love, real love, true love. And remember that love is mutual, right? Love isn't just a one sided coin as it's made out to be in a lot of these relationships. You really got to focus on the whole picture of love. It's not just, one sided where I love you and you beat the hell out of me. And that's what I saw from my mom for so many years was she thought she could change him. She thought he was right on the brink of changing, and if she just hung in there another, you know, year or two, that he was going to be that perfect man that he had laid himself out to be when they met originally. So it's a challenge, man. I remember the first time that I witnessed domestic violence, and it was really weird because I was 7 years old, D, and I gotten in trouble because I had ran late at a friend's house. I ended up having dinner over there, and I got home, and my stepfather took me into the backyard, and he said, there's something that we have to discuss. He's like, you're not going to go around and be undisciplined. And this is what happens to undisciplined little boys. And he turned around and he punched me square in the face and knocked me backwards off of the picnic bench that I was sitting on. At 7 years old, and that was the first time I'd ever been hit in the face. That was the first, and I got hit by, this wasn't like some small guy, right? This guy was like 6'3", 230, 240 pounds, solid guy. This wasn't, some little guy, and he punched me and I fell backwards. And I remember he stood me up and he walked me in the house. And right before we got to the front door, he said, whatever you do, you better not say anything to your mom. And I walk in, right? And you know how 7-year-olds are, right? They're like, right? I'm crying and I'm like just in shock because I just got punched in the face for the first time. And I remember walking in, and my mom, she comes around the corner and she sees me, and the compassion that fills her face. She's like, "Baby, what's wrong? What's going on?" And I'm like, right? I don't want to tell her because I'm scared to death. But obviously, and my nose is like swelling up now from where he hit me. And finally, I'm like, "He hit me, Mom! He hit me!" And she starts screaming at him, and he jumps on her. And that was the first time I witnessed domestic violence, where I watched him hit my mom right there in front of me, right after he had hit me. And I look back at that and I go, why wasn't that the breaking moment? Why wasn't that the moment that my mom said, "No, hell no, we're out of here. We're not playing this game." But that was the starting point, and then it just kind of carried over from there. What about you? Do you remember the first time you witnessed it?
A lot of it was the again, mine was more on the psychological level. My dad got a virus. He got encephalitis. His brain swelled. So he got this brain damage. I guess it took him several years to find out what it was. But he went from a very calm, easygoing guy, whatever else, and he would just trigger. Like he would just all of a sudden get violent over something that nobody could really predict. But he never shouted. He never screamed. He was incredibly soft spoken, but he would say things. He would say things that would put a chill down your brain. And he was like a hand-to-hand combat instructor in the military, incredibly strong, taught us to fight, but he taught me and my stepmother how to fight. So that didn't work out well when he wasn't there. But he would say things like, he goes, you know how easy it would be for me to bury you all and walk away.
Oh yeah.
Okay,
Oh
so
wow.
so that's the stuff. Even my stepmother, you are so lucky that I took you and your handicapped son in. Don't you ever define me.
Mm-hmm.
So it was like always it was the veiled threats. It was this hidden fear that isn't always about physical violence. It's that manipulative cruelty that can really freeze someone from
I
moving forward,
I
right?
remember those conversations too, Dee. I remember him telling me, one day you're going to come home and you're going to find your mother buried in the backyard. And also telling my mom right in front of me, one day, you're going to come home and find your son buried in the backyard because he's a little asshole.
Yep.
Like just stuff like that. And it was like, holy cow, man, am I going to be alive tomorrow? Like you really started to think that way, and you didn't want to do anything to piss them off because you genuinely thought they were going to bury you in the backyard. And I really believe that there would have come a time where if you push him hard enough, he would have. There was no doubt in my mind. I was terrified of him. My mother was terrified of him, and yeah, it's really interesting how fear captivates the brain and can actually create this manipulative, controlling factor where you feel like there's no escape, there's no way out, and all you can do is just keep playing the game and playing along and hoping
Yep.
that there's going to be an opportunity where things are going to change and things are going to get better. And that's the sad part is I see so many people out there that are in these circumstances. And as we're closing out this segment, because we're getting to about the 30-minute mark, I want to talk about law enforcement specifically and some things that we need to be cautious about when we're dealing with domestic violence.
Well, I think that
One,
goes
and
back
D was,
to what we teach is trauma informed care, right? when,
yeah,
when when you meet somebody in that domestic thing and you're like, what went on here, and you're looking at someone with a lack of apathy on your face, your body language, the arms are crossed, you're realizing the
absolutely.
big report that you're gonna have to write, and then he's probably not going to press charges anyway, so it's a waste of my time. And all that body language emits from a law enforcement officer or an MP, and the person's sitting there thinking like, nobody's going to believe me, he's just going to hurt me more. If I complain, it could be worse for me or my kids. Like you have that kind of internal trauma that gets built upon. And then that whole love thing, I want to touch back on what you said quickly before. If my dad ever hit me, he would come into my room without a doubt, either later that night or at least the next day would be the longest, and he would be crying because he hurt me. And he grew up in a Catholic orphanage, one of the ones that didn't do well. He had a lot of abuse stories, and he's like, I can't believe I turned into that, and like, I'm so sorry, and I love you so much. And he would shower you with love and affection and read a book with you and sing to you, and he would do all those things to prove that he loved you afterwards. And I don't
Oh
think it's
wow.
that much different in a spousal relationship where an abuser comes back and is so upset with themselves that they lost that control. And if you're dealing with a military or paramilitary spouse that has gone through some really traumatic stuff, you're even more inclined to be like supportive and wanting that love, wanting it to be the last time and all that kind of stuff. So I think that psychological element is really overlooked in all of our training. And it's certainly overlooked in military and paramilitary training for MPs and law enforcement officers, or even first responders and nursing staff. They don't know that how you ask the questions, how your body language presents when you're dealing with somebody who's been victimized, can do a lot for either giving them the courage to move forward and helping themselves, or discourage them to the point where they're mute. And that goes all the way through to the court and justice system where that's problematic. So I think for training, that's why trauma informed care training is so very important, and you know that as well.
Absolutely. And I would say that the three biggest key things that I key in on as a law enforcement officer when I go to a domestic violence call, number one, how I show up. That you're right. That is so important from the moment that you pull up in your police car, how are you showing up for that call? Are you showing up all in and ready? Or are you showing up kind of like, oh man, I need to go to this call and then I'm going to go grab some breakfast, or, or are you showing up and you're there because you know that you're needed? And then when you get there, are you staying rational in emotional situations? When people are screaming back and forth, you don't need to jump into the screaming. You need to be the rational one. And sometimes screaming is okay. Sometimes two people just blah 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 blah. They're just pushing the energy back at each other.
They're
And at
both in fight response at that point, and
yeah,
they're not thinking with any rational mindset whatsoever.
exactly. So it's really important that you stay rational, and we're going to save ego states for another day. We're not going to give you that nugget today, but it's important that you stay rational. And finally, I think the last tip is neutrality. You need to stay neutral. The other the advantage of staying rational and neutral is you're more self-aware. So you're going to be paying more attention to your surroundings, which is huge for your officer safety. You're going to be more aware when things stand out that shouldn't be. You're always going to be paying attention, looking for weapons and looking for threats and looking at your environment and where the risk factors are and things like that. You're always looking at that. But I think it's huge that you definitely stay rational and you stay neutral, even in the most challenging situations. And I also want to make sure that you understand, if you get there and they're throwing blows, you got to understand that our philosophy is really simple, right? We're focused on peace as long as peace is an option, right? But when you get there and blows are being thrown and you have to get physical, we're not telling you to get there and try to de-escalate everything no matter what. That's never going to be the case. When you show up, if you have to use force, if you have to to do something to break up the fight or whatever the case may be. But also remember, force goes up and force goes down. So again, stay rational even when you're using force, because when you become emotional and you start to take the attack personal on you, even though it has nothing to do with you, that's when it becomes an emotional booby trap for you, and you got to be cautious about that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Anything, any final things you want to add before we close this out?
I just think one last thing outside of the military and paramilitary MPs and police officers or first responders, as a support or a family member, if someone comes to you and starts to open up, they're feeling, either emotionally or financially or physically abused in any way, shape, or form, your job is not to judge. Your job is to help them get the help they need. And you don't have to understand. And you don't have to say, hey, why in the heck are you still here? Or why aren't you doing something about this? They're already in such an emotional, confusing place. They need someone who has that empathy, has that trauma informed care background and training to help them. So just get them to a social services outlet that can be there and manage it properly, because judgment on top of everything else is just going to demean their self-worth even more, and often it will deny them the ability to have that courage to step up and say something about it.
And there you go. Segment number 1 for Going Beyond the Call is officially in the books.
Woo woo.
So remember, guys, if you would like to reach out to us, if you have any questions, comments, concerns, this is going to be posted on Facebook. It's going to be posted on LinkedIn. We're also going to put it on our YouTube channel as well. As you're watching this, if you're on YouTube, subscribe. If you're on Facebook, LinkedIn, like, share, comment, and help us to get the word out there, guys. We really genuinely want to, get this training out there to everybody that we possibly can, so we can start making a better impact on the lives of our first responders, our military personnel, and of course just people in general as human beings. So again, don't forget to check out our book. Dee, you got our book there?
I do.
Yeah, man. So Going Beyond the Call, Mental Health Fitness for Public Safety Professionals. You can go to gbtcbook.com. Get your copy today. We talk about all these things and more that we're discussing, and really focusing on the mental health aspect for public safety professionals. And if you want to learn more about us and what we do, you can also go to gbtc911.com. Until next time, good night, everybody.
Good night.